tell you another story about something that happened with Blackwater in Iraq. It happened on last Christmas Eve, inside of the Green Zone. An off-duty Blackwater contractor allegedly shot and killed the bodyguard to the Iraqi Vice President Adel Abdel Mahdi inside of the Green Zone. Imagine if an Iraqi killed Dick Cheney's bodyguard, what would happen? Well, what happened to this individual is Blackwater snuck him out of the country, and he remains a free man right now. And when this came up during a congressional hearing in February, Congressman Dennis Kucinich was able to get Blackwater's lawyer, who showed up instead of Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater, to testify, to admit that Blackwater had taken him out of the country. And he said, I want the record to reflect that Blackwater executives may have been complicit in the flight of a murder suspect from a crime scene. That was one of several incidents involving Blackwater USA in the last year. They're also alleged to have shot and killed a journalist outside of a government building. Another incident in which 4 Iraqis were alleged to have been killed. Another in which 5 are alleged to have been wounded. 3 guards outside of another government building. No, this is a pattern. And it's not just a pattern involving Blackwater. You see, these private contractors that are part of this force that's now bigger than the U.S. military in Iraq have turned the country into a Wild West atmosphere over there, where immunity and impunity go hand in hand. Of the hundreds of thousands of individuals who have passed through Iraq since March of 2003 as private contractors, only 2 have ever been prosecuted for any crimes whatsoever under any law. Neither of them were armed contractors like those that work for Blackwater. One was a former KBR official who was alleged to have stabbed a coworker in a kitchen. The other was a man who pled guilty to possession of child pornography images on his computer at Abu Ghraib prison. So that means either we have tens of thousands of Boy Scouts who are running around Iraq as mercenaries, or something is fundamentally rotten with the system. If you're a U.S. soldier in Iraq and you commit a crime, you can be court-martialed. There have been at least 64 courts-martialed on murder-related charges alone in Iraq. Not a single mercenary has been prosecuted for any crimes whatsoever. And so if you're an Iraqi civilian who's standing back and watching this situation unfold, what message does that send to your country, where even people who murder and torture and shoot civilians have nothing happen to them? In fact, the contractors in Iraq reportedly have a motto: what happens here today stays here today. That should be chilling to anyone who believes in transparency of what should be the most sensitive function of a state, the decision to wage war against another people. What happens here today stays here today. A contractor for a mercenary company called Triple Canopy told the Washington Post that we were told from the very beginning, if something ever happened and the Iraqis were trying to arrest us, they would simply put you in the trunk of a car and sneak you out of the country. And that's exactly what's been happening. That's the response to the criminal activity of the contractors in Iraq. Now, I want to leave ample time for us to have a discussion here, so I want to move toward wrapping up. But I want to say a couple of things. One is that if we look at why the administration uses these forces, it tells a very disturbing tale. You see, take the nation of Chile, for instance. Chile is opposed to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It was a rotating member of the United Nations Security Council when the invasion was being debated at the UN. It said, we don't want to join the coalition of the willing to attack another country and occupy it. And so when Chile said, no, we're not going to send our soldiers, the administration turned to Blackwater, which began working with a recruiter in Chile who had been a soldier under General Pinochet's military, a brutal military dictatorship. And they began hiring Chilean commandos, flying them up here to North Carolina, to Moyac, before being deployed in Iraq on the U.S. government payroll, being paid by the U.S. taxpayers. This is an absolute subversion of the sovereignty of the nation of Chile, whose government the Bush administration recognizes as legitimate and democratically elected. That's the case with the vast majority of the people who are now part of the corporate army occupying Iraq. 118,000 of those contractors are Iraqis. It's the way that Nike and Disney operate. They have children making clothes for children, and at the top, you've got the Americans and the Brits taking in all of the profit. It's one of the most grotesque aspects of the occupation, is that they're actually hiring Iraqis to occupy their country in the service of a private war corporation that's literally making a killing off of the war. And the vast majority of the contractors there aren't U.S. citizens. And so what this means is that you can keep a draft off the table. You don't need to rely on your citizenry to staff the army that's going to go on this global conquest. You can simply rent up the poor of the world to use them as cannon fodder to take down the poor of the world. But it's not just about the draft. It also has to do with the military machine itself. Bush only has to own half the force. The deaths of contractors don't get counted in the official death toll. Their crimes go undocumented, unreported, and almost entirely unpunished. It's like having a shadow army. And people and critics of what I've been saying say, well, how else would we be able to protect our diplomats in Iraq, or how else would we be able to occupy Iraq? Well, we wouldn't be able to occupy Iraq. General David Petraeus himself said it, as did Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Without the private forces, the occupation would be untenable. And so what this means is that there's nothing democratic about the decision to occupy Iraq, and there's almost nothing that involves the citizenry of this country, except for those 170,000 individuals who are deployed there as U.S. soldiers. And so this is a revolution in military affairs that's underway. I want to close by saying something about the state of the media in this country today. Because I think that it's important to remember that there was a recent AP Ipsos poll about the number of deaths of Iraqis since the war began. And the majority of U.S. residents who responded to this poll believe that less than 10,000 Iraqis have died since the start of the war. According to Johns Hopkins study, it's at least 750,000 Iraqis. Bush himself, not so long ago, estimated it was about 30,000. 750,000. If you take into account, and I think it's much higher than that, but if you take into account the decades of sanctions against Iraq going back to the Gulf War, where over 1 million Iraqis died, you're talking about a mass slaughter on par with Pol Pot that has taken place in Iraq. And this isn't about Americans are bumpkins or Americans are stupid. It's about the culture of the media in this country that is not the fourth estate anymore, but is for the state. And so we have a media culture where Iraqis are nameless individuals with no stories. We had a high point in media coverage of tragedies in this country when the Virginia Tech shooting happened. I don't know how many of you were watching the coverage of this, but I got very wrapped up in watching it because I thought it was incredible how many of the names of those victims we got to know because their parents were interviewed on television or their roommates were interviewed. And I remember the Lebanese-American woman who was a great musician and a dancer, and her father so strongly keeping his composure, and it was so clear what he was doing. He wanted the world to know who his daughter was. And so he tried and hoped against hope not to break down and cry when he talked about his daughter. And we heard from her roommate and from her siblings. And we heard the story of the Holocaust survivor who threw his body in front of the door to save his students. And we heard from their neighbors and their friends and their parents and their siblings. And we heard about the dreams that were shattered, the lives that were stolen, the future that was taken away from them. And we knew them as human beings with names and friends and families who missed them and were angry and were sad. And they were human beings to us. And it was a horrible, horrifying tragedy. But Virginia Tech is one day in one Iraqi neighborhood, in 2 Iraqi neighborhoods, in 3 Iraqi neighborhoods, every single day. And if we knew the names of the Iraqi victims, their stories, that they were a great dancer, that they were a great singer, that they were a great musician or a great student, or that they were funny and made their friends laugh and they had a smile that was electric when they would walk into a room, the war would end tomorrow. The war would end tomorrow because it wouldn't just be the war in Iraq. It would be victims with names and stories whose lives were taken away. And so when we talk about the responsibility for this war, yes, it's the responsibility of the president who continues to keep U.S. troops and mercenaries in that country, and the Congress that continues to fund it, but also the media, which refuses to humanize the victims of the war, which would be the single greatest blow to its continuation. Thank you.